The next speaker is Professor Tim Benton. Tim is the champion for the UK Global Fund Security Programme. GFS brings together the key public research funders to address the multidisciplinary issues of global food security in a coordinated manner. Tim is also a professor at University of Leeds, where he is a leading researcher on issues to do with agriculture and the environment, with a particular interest on how best to achieve the joint needs of production and environmental sustainability in a time of global change. Tim, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Peter for inviting me, and thank you all to listening, and very much thank you for the preceding talk, because it very much introduced what I wanted to talk about. So I want to talk about the challenge of sustainable intensification. As has just been outlined, we have a population trajectory that is on track for about 9.2 billion people by mid-century, but we have one fundamental constraint, and that is we have only one planet. And where we have finite resources, we have to be careful that we manage those resources properly to allow us to use the planet continually over centuries to come. So we all know about the growth in global food demand, that we're going to have about 35% more people to feed. As the global middle class grows in size, people want to eat more. So it's not just about the number of mouths, it is what we want to consume. We therefore know that lots more food will be needed. That doesn't necessarily mean that as the population increases and people demand more, we have to grow exactly the same amount more, because there are a lot of ways that we can reduce things like waste in the food chain. You know, we in the UK throw away quite a large proportion of food uneaten that we buy, and changing that sort of behaviour would reduce some of the pressure for production growth. But whichever way you cut the cake, the FAO, the common estimate is that we'll need 70% more food by mid-century. It might not be 70%, it might be 40%, it might be 30%, but we need to increase production growth. So this leads to the food security challenge. We need to increase food production against a whole range of constraints, but we don't have a lot more land that's available around the world. So that leads to the inevitable logical conclusion that we need to farm the same area and get more out per unit area. That's the intensification of outputs. Now, I go to a lot of meetings in my role where we talk about food security, and we talk about production growth and technology, poverty and livelihoods, crop science, and so on and so on. But there is the elephant, the green sustainability elephant. And very often, as already outlined, sustainability as a term is used in multiple ways, and sometimes the misunderstanding about what it means can become almost a greenwash. Whereas what we absolutely need to do is have sustainability at the heart of what we do. Because without worrying about sustainability, then we will not be able to sustain food output. That's what the word means, sustaining. And unless we take care to do it, then in 50 years' time or 100 years' time, we won't be able to do it the way that we want to. So we have a sustainability challenge, that is to produce more and at the same time minimize the impact on the environment. The term sustainable intensification defines that. Growing or maintaining production whilst minimizing inputs and enhancing what are known as ecosystem services. Now, ecology is important. We sometimes got a bit sidetracked by thinking about the natural world in terms of just wild bird numbers. But ecology is important for many different things. This is a figure from the National Ecosystem Assessment published last year, and it shows in this column that there are a whole range of goods that we rely on as society: food, fibre, energy, drinking water, and so on. And those come out of the environment, and they are underpinned by a whole range of different services that the environment and ecology provides. So, for example, food production, crops, depend on a whole range of things. They depend on the soil, which depends on decomposition, which depends on biodiversity. Crop production depends on access to water that's of good enough quality, access to nutrients, very often pest control, keeping the aphids at bay that you don't see until they outbreak, a lot of pests and diseases are kept under control by natural means. So the production of crops or livestock is underpinned fundamentally by a whole range of services. But in addition to that, there are a whole range of services that are not necessarily intimately tied in with productivity, such as clean water, such as flood control, such as greenhouse gas storage, carbon storage, to prevent climate change, and so on. So all of these things are important. They're all important in different ways, and we're only just beginning to understand the value of them to society. And the danger that we have, we might face is that by driving very hard for a particular good or service, we impact on other goods and services that we value greatly. So, for example, there's been recently published the European Nitrogen Assessment Report, which shows that when you take into account the costs of nitrogen use, as well as the benefits to agriculture, the costs in terms of impact on air quality, impact on health, impact on groundwater, impact on terrestrial biodiversity, impact on water downstream out to coast and sea fisheries and so on. When you take into account those whole costs, then they can outweigh the benefits that we get from using nitrogen in farmland. So we have to think much more in the round about balancing all of these different aspects of environmental goods for the production. So, how do we do in sustainable intensification? And this is an area that is currently very heavily researched. Does it mean that all farming needs to be organic? Does it mean that all produce should be locally consumed, minimizing transport miles? Does it mean we should all be vegetarian? Does it mean we should all have beards and wear sandals and be professors of ecology? No to all of those. So what I want to do is now just talk through some of these for a minute. So, sustainable intensification. There are many, many win-wins about doing more with less that benefit everybody. So, for example, managing soils for production. We haven't put enough thought in, and we certainly haven't put enough research into understanding soils and how best to utilize them for production purposes. A lot of the energy that goes in tillage is there because you're trying to repair the soil that you have compacted using the tractor in the first place. So there are ways that we can manage soils and the ways that we can think of managing soils that will enhance that. There are ways that we can think of managing the non-cropped areas for the beneficial organisms that aid production. Now, we know a lot about pollination. In the UK, pollinators are worth about £430 million per year. But natural enemies, there's a small wasp on this slide. Many people don't know that there are hundreds of species of small wasps that keep the aphids under control. You don't see the value of them because you only ever notice when they don't work, but you don't notice all of the times that they do work. And actually managing the land, the marginal strips, in a way that produces the wasps saves everybody. Many ways that we can reduce the waste of input and make sure that the right intervention is made at the right time in the right place with the right amount. So there's a lot of research that's going on to do with precision agriculture. And here, there's a picture on the slide from Simon Blackmore at Harper Adams of a potential robotic weeding device. Now, we have the technology to do these sorts of things, have independent little robots that can trundle around the field. They can use machine vision to identify when plants are weeds and just spray that particular weed. So you could get down to about 1% of chemical use rather than just using the plant protection products right across the whole field. Many ways of doing that. I was talking to somebody recently who is manufacturing a chemical coating for nitrogen to make it stick to soil better rather than stay in the water column and just leach straight out and into the water. That makes sense. Many things we can do with recycling. Many things we can do with genetic improvements for plants and animals. So, for example, here is some work that's been recently done by Christopher Ui at John Innes Centre. And what you can see in the main picture is a very silvery sort of wheat and a very green sort of wheat. And the silverness is a wax that the plants put onto their outside to give them a kind of waterproof coating, and it actually stops them losing a lot of water because these wheat were developed from stock that came from Mediterranean countries. But actually, Christopher's work has shown that by producing a wax, the plants are using resources that could go into the seed. So there is a yield penalty. And actually, the plants don't need the wax for most of the time living in the UK environment. So by looking at the genes, identifying the ones that produce the wax, identifying ones from varieties where the wax is not produced and moving them across, not GM, not genetic modification, just using standard genetic techniques, allows higher growth, higher yielding varieties to be produced. So sustainable agriculture is more than just thinking about what goes on in the field. It is about thinking of the whole system. It's not just about managing fields and how we do it. So, for example, you could have an extensive dairy farm that you go into the field and it looks fantastic. You know, low grazing density, lots of buttercups and so on. But that extensive dairy farm could take its slurry off field and put it onto a farm somewhere else. That needs to be taken into account when you do the thinking about the whole farm system. It could be buying in soy feed from South America, and that could be leading to further deforestation in South American rainforests. So that needs to be taken into account. It could also have a farm shop. And with a farm shop, what tends to happen is that people tend to make lots of one-off trips to buy a particular product, which contributes quite a lot to the food miles in the food system relative to going to a big supermarket and buying everything in one place. So just by looking at a particular farm or a particular field doesn't tell you very much about sustainability in the field, in the whole. So we need to think a bit beyond individual fields. And a couple of years ago, I posed this question. If you have a landscape that has to provide goods and services, so let's say biodiversity and let's say agricultural yield, do you get more of both if you farm extensively across the whole area, or whether you concentrate your farming intensively in one place and set aside some land for managing the biodiversity in another place? That's the kind of Henry Ford question. Is specialization the key to sustainable production? And the answer does depend on where you are, but it is often yes. You get more of both if you specialize different packets of land to do different things. So what that actually means is that in some landscapes, extensive farming is a very sensible solution to being sustainable, but in many places, extensive farming is not the best solution. And actually, what seems to be the case is that, especially in high production landscapes, intensive farming plus a network of land that is properly laid out, properly managed for agriculture, can be better at producing ecological goods and services and also producing agricultural yield. And the same thought process can extend at whatever spatial scale. So a colleague recently did a study and showed that in the EU, if the organic area increases to 20%, then our overall demand for food in the EU wouldn't drop. So what that would mean was that our yield would go down because organic farming yields less, and someone somewhere else would have to increase their production to compensate. And what that means is that we'd have a local environmental benefit, but transport the environmental cost to sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia or so on. And that applies whether you're talking about land or whether you're talking about water or whether you're talking about any of our other resources that are needed. So organic farming is often perceived as the main route to greening, especially by some people, but it's not necessarily the case. Here is a study that was published a couple of years ago, a 17-year study of somewhere in the Midwest, where they had 4 treatments: conventional tillage, no tillage, low input, and an organic treatment. And they did a complete life cycle assessment for the cost, and they converted the cost into energy terms. And what they found was that organic and conventional agriculture were about the same efficiency, but with organic farming you need to have a bigger plot to grow the same amount of yield. But both of the no tillage and low input systems could maintain high yields and be considerably better in terms of the carbon accounting because they were much more efficient. So conventional farming can be a really good sustainable solution if the landscape has other areas that are managed for other services. If the farms work hard on resource use efficiency through conservation, agricultural, precision farming, and if farms minimize their off-farm effects in terms of leakage of nitrogen or greenhouse gas and so on. So that organic farming is not necessarily the entire route to sustainable agriculture. Next thing, is it about eating local produce? And again, the answer is no, because the life cycle assessment, thinking about the whole, you have to balance the transport costs and the production costs. And in many circumstances, it is much better to use the high tropical sunlight to grow whatever produce and then transport it around the world than to heat a greenhouse in England and minimize the transport miles. And it is actually quite a red herring in many ways to think about transport miles as being a clean index of sustainability. So this quote comes from an American study that showed for an American family, if they eat red meat 1 day less a week, that would have the same benefit as if everything was grown in their garden. It's such a small component of the overall thing. What we have to do is to be a bit smarter. The third sacred cow about animal produce. Now, we all know that animal produce is quite expensive in environmental terms. It requires more resources to produce, whatever those resources are. So some people say, well, we need to solve the world's food security crisis by making everybody go vegetarian. And that's not the answer. Clearly, that's not the answer. There are arguments for saying eating less meat or dairy might have some positive benefits for health, so it might be a sensible strategy to do. But livestock systems are very important in many ways. One way is that if nitrogen costs are going to get more expensive, using animals to produce the organic fertilizer, organic as in organically produced fertilizer, is a sensible thing to do. And also, grazing systems around the world, and I've just come from the upland session, grazing systems around the world are ecologically very important. So it doesn't make sense to say, let's get rid of livestock systems at all. So, sustainable intensification. The S in sustainable intensification is not optional. We have got to do it in the long run. We can't go on as business as usual plus a tweak here or there. We have got to make true gains in sustainability. But there are lots of business opportunities to be had, and sometimes I talk to people and they're kind of scared about change, but actually they're business opportunities. So, for example, another picture from Simon Blackmore at Harper Adams. He can imagine a future where we have fleets of autonomous little robots that trundle around the field. They use far less energy, they produce far less greenhouse gas, they put the chemicals in the right place, they weed things out, they harvest when the crop is ready to be harvested so that we get much less food waste, and so on. Lots of scope for innovation. Knowledge is going to be increasingly valuable, and we need to find ways of getting the knowledge through to the user community. There will be benefits from managing the land at a larger scale, rather than just thinking in terms of a field-by-field scale. And there are all sorts of benefits in terms of harvesting the public opinion for being the stewards of the land. Many people see that as a prime role and a prime ecosystem service that farming produces, and there will be business opportunities there. But under all of this, supporting all of this, we need innovation. Innovation in agronomy, in agriculture, in engineering, and in ecology. And then just a final slide. This is just to introduce the Global Food Security Programme, which is across government, across the major public funders. And what we're trying to do with the Global Food Security Programme is to bring together all of the people who fund research so that we have a joined up knowledge of what we're doing. We produce coming out of the Foresight Programme, we produce a kind of UK research strategy that we deliver and we monitor. We enhance engagement and understanding, and we act as a kind of single contact point for where research is needed. So we are trying to be, in the Global Food Security Programme, we are trying to be joined up. So final slide, conclusions. Sustainability requires that we manage ecology. Production and ecology, I don't think, need to be in conflict. And there are many routes towards sustainable intensification, but we need to think up in a joined up systems-based way. So thank you very much.